there is some valuable advice from Shaykh Saalih Al-Shaykh about seeking knowledge. And its principles. So inshallah, we'll go through maybe 4 or 5 points of benefit that the Shaykh has mentioned, because this will give us a good understanding as to how we pursue knowledge, how do we acquire knowledge, how do we memorize knowledge, and how do we become rooted in knowledge. And so there are some real valuable benefits here in what the Shaykh is going to say. So the Shaykh says, at the beginning of his commentary upon this book, he says that we shall mention here certain affairs that are related to a seeker of knowledge, someone who is a student of knowledge, seeking knowledge, and the manner in which he takes knowledge from other people, from the sheikhs, from the students of knowledge. How does he take that knowledge? So obviously this relates to everybody sat here, and ourselves likewise. And so he mentions 6 or 7 points. Some of them, we'll mention maybe 4 or 5 of them, because they are fairly straightforward. So from them, he says that the first thing that should be noted is that a person should always remind himself, always remember yourself, that knowledge, seeking knowledge, is actually worship. So talabul ilm is actually ibadah in and of itself. And it is something by which you seek nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So basically, as sitting here today, this is an act of worship, and it is something by which we seek nearness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we see that the scholars have mentioned that the greatest of the involuntary deeds, of the tatawwu', those deeds which are not from the wajibat, not from the obligatory affairs, that the greatest of deeds after them is actually seeking knowledge. So in other words, after the establishment of the prayer and the fasting and the zakah and all of the other wajibat which was wajib upon a person, then after them the greatest of the deeds which are virtuous is actually seeking knowledge. And the Shaykh says, in fact, although this is a ruling upon knowledge, in many instances seeking knowledge would actually be wajib upon many of the students of knowledge. Why? Because most of us, many of us, wouldn't really have acquired sufficient knowledge in order to fulfill the affairs of worship, or likewise to understand the foundations of his religion, like in the affairs of Tawheed and Aqidah and Iman. Most of us are deficient in that regard. So because of that, knowledge is actually wajib in those areas. So it shows that it has a much more important place than what we think it does. And so for this reason, the Shaykh says, when you understand this and when you realize this, when you remind yourself that knowledge is an act of worship, it is taqarrub ila Allah, it is something that brings you closer to Allah, then a person will never become lazy or indifferent to seeking knowledge. Rather, he will have a different attitude towards knowledge. And so, in terms of memorizing, studying, writing, seeking out books and so on and so forth, again, his attitude will change. So the Shaykh then goes on to he mentions another point that we see, that some of the scholars mention that even seeking knowledge, some of the scholars have said that it is even more virtuous than striving in the path of Allah, meaning jihad. Meaning that jihad which is involuntary, not involuntary, which is voluntary, which is at-tatawwu', which is not the one which is fard ayn, but the fard kifaya. That it is even more virtuous and superior to that type of jihad. And the reason is because we see that knowledge has its benefit is something that extends to other people. It extends to other people more so than the benefit in striving in the path of Allah in terms of the jihad. So the general principle is that whose benefit is more wider and reaches more people, then that has a greater status and it is of greater benefit. And that's why, as we said, the way of many of the scholars that they stated that seeking knowledge is better and more superior than striving in the path of Allah in terms of the jihad, which is fard kifaya, not fard ayn. The second principle he mentions then, so the first principle is reminding yourself that that seeking ilm is ibadah. The second principle he mentions here is that what are the ways of seeking knowledge. Now, practically speaking, what are the ways of seeking knowledge? What he means here is, like for example, that you attend the gatherings of the sheikhs, the people of knowledge, the scholars, and likewise the tulab al-ilm, the students of knowledge, and likewise the muallimeen, those who teach the knowledge, and likewise a person attends, he hears, he listens, and he writes, or maybe he even might record. However, the Shaykh says that all of this is not sufficient. That's so far after all of this that you seek the gatherings of the scholars and the sheikhs and the students of knowledge and the teachers, and then you attend, and then you listen, and then you write, and then you might even record. At this point, this actually isn't sufficient. He says this is not sufficient. Rather, a person must study and revise. Right? So that's where the studying takes place. Right? The studying takes place when you actually study and revise. And you study and revise as if you were going to be tested on the material tomorrow. So he says that what this means is that obviously you study, you pay attention to the notes that you've written, and you look at the words that have been used, you look at the evidences which have been provided, you arrange and organize things. So you take your notes and you arrange them, organize them, you extract things from them and whatever. And so all of this is what we call at-talaqqi. This is what we call the acquisition of knowledge. That's where the acquisition actually takes place, right? In terms of how you take what you've heard, what you've written, then you look at it, you revise it, you extract things from it, you organize it, you arrange it, and then you memorize it, and then this is what we call at-talaqqi. This is the actual place where knowledge is acquired. So the Shaykh says, so just hearing and writing isn't enough. Alone, they do not really benefit. That you hear and that you write, and then you'll leave the room, you'll go away, and by tomorrow afternoon you've forgotten everything, and by next week you've forgotten everything. So this isn't really what seeking knowledge is about. And if you were to ask, like the Shaykh says, after 1 year, you probably wouldn't remember anything. But obviously, if we were to say after a week or a month, then you'd hardly remember the lesson that you had the week before or the month before. So the Shaykh says that when you have a revision and you return back to your notes, and you look at the text and you revise, you look at the words and you look at the explanation and the benefits that were given, and then you memorize the proofs, you make note of the proofs, and you go back to those proofs, you read them, and so on and so forth. This is where the actual knowledge is acquired. And so this obviously is very, very important. And we see that most people we don't really seek knowledge in this manner, but this is where the knowledge is actually, how it is sought and how it is learnt and how it is conveyed from generation to generation. Then the Shaykh says, and then he actually goes on to mention 3 steps. He gives us 3 practical steps. And he says that, okay, we'll mention certain practical steps which a person should be eager to act upon. The first of them is that, first of all, that when you write, that you write with clear writing. That when you're making notes, and when you're writing the benefits, and when you're writing the points that the teacher is mentioning, that you write in a very clear, legible writing. You don't write too small, and So the Shaykh says that write it in a manner that when you come back to it and you revise it, you're able to read it. And don't worry about paper, because there's plenty of paper present in the world. It says Walillahi alhamd, there's plenty of paper, so don't worry about papers. Always write clearly, don't rush. So that when you go back, you're not struggling to see what you've written. That's the first thing. Second thing is that you should always strive to summarize whatever you have read or whatever you have written. So when you've heard a lesson, or when you've written from a lesson, you should come back and write. If I was to write, for example, a page summary of all the main points that have been mentioned, then you should always try to make a talkhis, a summary of each lesson. So you take your notes and write down, okay, these point 1, point 2, point 3, and so you've made a summary of that lesson. Then when you come back to it, you can refer to that summary rather than refer back to the whole lesson. So basically, you're always extracting the benefits and making the summary of each lesson that you've attended or that you've heard. And the third thing that the Shaykh mentions here, obviously, is revision. So whatever you've wrote from the Shaykh or from the student of knowledge, and you should go back to it and try to memorize the main points, because the Shaykh says that knowledge disappears if you don't pay attention to it. Knowledge disappears. And so if you don't keep to it and attend to it and revise it, and it's like if you leave your animal, your domestic animal, or you leave a camel, for example, untied, it's going to disappear. This is the nature of knowledge. Likewise, it's the nature of the Quran. The Quran disappears from your memory if you don't keep attending to it and revising and memorizing. The same with knowledge. Same with knowledge of the religion. And so the Shaykh says that we see that there are many books, many foundational books that explain, for example, Aqidah or Tawheed or other areas. And what we see, a person might just read it once or twice. The Shaykh says what we do is that we read a book 10 or 20 times. 10 or 20 times. Why? Because every time we come back to the book, we see a benefit that we didn't see before. So the point here is that a person shouldn't say, for example, that we see many people saying, oh, that book, yeah, I read that book. I read that book, now I'm on to this book. Like, we read the book once, now move to the other book. We see the difference, that the true and real scholars, they actually read a book maybe 10, 20, 30 times. Every time they read it, they might find some other benefit or something that they missed. And every time they go back to the book, they see the benefit, then they'll write that benefit down. Right? It's not just casual reading. You sat there, on the sofa, lying down, falling asleep maybe, or just something to do in the meanwhile. You pick a book, no pen, no notes, and you just casual reading to pass the time. And obviously, as you're reading, the benefits are popping up in your mind, but come 2-3 hours later, it's all gone. Right? So this is not the type of study and the reading that the Shaykh, the Shaykh is saying that when you actually want to study a book, literally you've got to devour that book. As in, you've got to read it once, twice, 3, 4, 5. Each time, you're making more and more notes. So basically, you just, as I said, you're literally devouring the book from every single angle that you think. This is what we call studying. This is what you call, and this is how a person, this is how he learns. This is how the knowledge becomes rooted in him. So the Shaykh says that when you take this approach, when you read the text, when you read the benefits, when you revise, when you read it again, then this is what will, the knowledge will become firmly rooted and established. And, and he says that when your knowledge is rooted like this, then everything which follows on from it will be the same. So if in your knowledge you're deeply rooted, then everything else that follows on that in that too you will be deeply rooted. Shaykh mentions here a principle. He says that when something which is sahih, when there's something that's sahih, whatever is built upon it will also be sahih. Whenever a construction is sound, everything else that builds on top of it will also be sound. When something is defective, whatever is built upon it, that too will be defective. When something is erroneous, is wrong, plain wrong, and whatever is built upon that is also plain wrong. 3 things he mentions. So for that reason, the Shaykh says that in order to build a sound foundation in terms of knowledge, then a person should really study knowledge in the manner that's described. Not treat it like you would read a novel or a book, like people just for pleasure or whatever. It's actually serious study. The third, so we finished the second point, and the second point, the ways of acquiring knowledge, how it takes place. You listen, you write, and then you go back, and then you do the actual acquisition of knowledge. And then there are 3 points that you mentioned, in terms of clear writing, then summarizing things, and then revising things. Now we move on to the third issue, which is the Shaykh says that the student of knowledge should realize that one particular book will have many explanations. For example, I mentioned that At-Tahawiyya has many explanations. There are many explanations. And we see that every person who writes an explanation has his own style. Some will have, someone will write just briefly. Some will have a very technical, very detailed style. Some will mention the fundamental issues and branch off into all of the subsidiary issues and exhaust them systematically. So we see that every explanation has its own little approach. And so what the Shaykh is saying here is that what we should do is that we should take one book, and we should use it as the foundation. So we take one book, for example. So we're going to take Shaykh Saalih al-Fawzan's book, Commentary upon At-Tahawiyya, right? And so he should use this as the foundation. Once he's used that as the foundation, then he can go to other explanations, and then he can add to the foundation he's already built. So the Shaykh is saying that, because we have such a diverse and rich amount of resources available to us, for example, the explanation of the three principles, Thalathatul Usul. We have many explanations of that. Likewise, we have the book Kashf al-Shubuhat, right? The doubts of the grave worshippers. We have many explanations. There's countless explanations of that book. We can go on and on for all of the various other books that we see, Kitab al-Tawheed, Aqidat al-Wasitiyya. So what a person should do is find one particular book, use it as the foundation, study it thoroughly, and then move on to other explanations where he will see different approaches, different methods, different styles of explanation, and so he will increase in that way. And the Shaykh mentions a verse, وَفَوْقَ كُلِّ ذِي عِلْمٍ عَلِيمٍ, that above everyone who has knowledge is someone who has more knowledge. And obviously at the end that refers back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is the all-knowing. But even amongst the people we see that amongst the people, even amongst the scholars, we see they vary in their knowledge and the types of knowledge. And so this is just an issue we should be aware of when it comes to studying these types of books and the various explanations and the benefit we can get from using one as the foundation and then moving to others as additional knowledge. Then we come to another benefit towards the end, and the Shaykh says here that very often the Shaykh says when it comes to studying these types of books on the issues of Tawheed and Aqidah and Iman, we often come to we deal with the astray groups, the astray sects. We have the Khawarij, we have the Murji'ah, we have the Mu'tazila, the Ash'ari. These are all groups who are present and they have deviations in the field of Aqidah. And the Shaykh says that many times that when we go through a book, we find that we will be addressing some of the doubts and deviations of these people. However, the Shaykh says that often many of the students, they come to me and they say, could you direct us to the books of these people so that we can go and have a look? And the Shaykh says that this is wrong. This is very wrong. A student of knowledge, someone who's seeking knowledge, should never ever go out and say, right, let me go and have a look at the books of the Ash'aris. Let me go and have a look at the books of the Mu'tazila, or the books of the Khawarij, or the books of the Murji, or the books of the Qadariyah. Let me just see what they're saying and compare it to. He says that this is wrong for a student of knowledge. And he says that even the scholars themselves, when they, for example, speak about the Ash'aris or the Maturidis or the Mu'tazila or the Jahmiyyah, they will be quoting through other scholars. Like they will say, for example, that Shaykh al-Islam Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah, he said such and such about the Ash'a'ira, or about their doctrines, or he said such and such about the Khawarij, or he said such and such about whatever. And even the scholars take this approach because they don't want to go and waste their time or subject themselves to these kind of issues by going to the books of the Jahmiyyah and the Khawarij and the Qadariyah, but you see them often quoting Ibn al-Qayyim, Ibn Taymiyyah and other scholars like that. So they will refer to the statements and the explanations and the refutations of the bona fide, trustworthy, firmly established scholars themselves, and will not themselves go to these books. So how much more then for the students who are taking knowledge from them? So the point being here then is that when a person is a beginner student of knowledge, he shouldn't go around reading every book he picks up from every author that he comes across Rather, he should stick to the firmly established, rooted scholars and their works, gain a thorough understanding from them, and not really go out and try to make studies of these books to see what's in there and see if he can refute them. This is not the way, because many a person in history, he has gone out intending to refute falsehood, and he ends up being convinced by that very same falsehood. Many examples like this that the scholars have mentioned. And in fact, most of the deviations which occurred were people who were upon the sunnah, and then they intended to refute bid'ah, but because their knowledge was weak, then they got enticed by that. But this is what happened, like for example, the people like the Ibn Qullab. These were people in the time of Imam Ahmad. They wanted to refute the Mu'tazila and the Jahmiyyah, but they themselves fell into that blameworthy kalam, and they departed and deviated from the sunnah. Right? So this shows that a student of knowledge should try to keep his feet firmly planted, and he should lay down the strong foundations for his creed and for his knowledge, and not to spend time going here and there and trying to look into these other books and these doubts and so on and so forth. So this is the end of the advice at the beginning that the Shaykh has mentioned. He then also has another benefit connected to this, and this generally relates to the issue of the aqidah. The aqidah, the creed which a person holds, and the meaning of the word aqidah, which means to something to become binded and tied, like a knot is tied. And what it means for our purpose here, it means that when something enters into the heart, then it firmly clings to the heart like this. It will not leave the heart. It clings and it won't leave the heart. And no doubt will make that thing, will make that knowledge to leave the heart. This is the meaning of aqidah. It means a knowledge which clings to your heart and which does not separate from that heart. No doubt will make that knowledge separate from that heart. This is the literal meaning, or this is the meaning of aqidah as we use it to refer to the affairs of belief and the affairs of the religion. So we see that the Shaykh says here that the knowledge of aqidah is something which all other branches of knowledge are dependent upon. They go back to the knowledge of aqidah. So for example, when you go back to the books of tafsir, the books of explanation of the Quran, then you will need knowledge of the aqidah. And for you to see that which is what he's speaking of here is that for you to have a good grounding, and for you to go through different disciplines like tafsir and fiqh and so on and so forth, that all of them ultimately they go back to issues of aqidah. And so if a person isn't firmly established and grounded in the aqidah, then he will likewise make mistakes in understanding Allah's speech and the speech of the Messenger, in other issues as well, in tafsir, in fiqh, in many other issues that pertain to the religion. And likewise, the aqidah itself, it is something which corrects a person's action, his amal, because his amal, his action is dependent upon the belief that he holds. So if his aqidah is sound, then everything that proceeds from him in his actions, that too will be sound. And the Shaykh then mentions how the heart is something which controls the rest of the body. And if the heart is sound, if the knowledge in the heart is sound, then all of the rest of the body will proceed in a similar manner. And this is based upon the well-known and famous hadith in which the Messenger said, indeed there is a morsel of flesh in the body, which if it is sound, then all of the body will be sound, and which if it is corrupt, then all of the body will be corrupt. Indeed, it is the heart. And Abu Huraira radiyallahu anhu, he said, the heart is the king, and the limbs the limbs are the soldiers. So if the king is upright, then the soldiers likewise will be upright. And if the king errs, he makes a mistake, then the soldiers likewise will make a mistake. Right? This is the nature of the relationship between the heart and the rest of the body. So for that reason, the Shaykh says here that I advise you all to have the greatest of concern with the affairs of Tawheed and Aqidah, and that you study them, reflecting upon them, and that you memorize the evidences, And because this is the knowledge that you will be in need of in all situations, in every situation, in the affairs of the unseen. You need to rely upon the affairs of Aqidah, because they're not based upon aql. The intellect and analogy and reflection, all these things cannot independently arrive at knowledge of the Aqidah and Tawheed. Right? So in all situations you will need to depend upon this knowledge, and so for that reason you have to give the greatest of concern to this. And this brings us to the end of this initial advice that Shaykh Saalih al-Shaykh gave with respect to how we should treat this issue of seeking knowledge, and especially when it comes to studying books like these.